Hello, I'm Judilee, and I'm a textile artist with a specialty in natural plant dyes and couture sewing. My personal work combines natural objects with natural plant dyeing, sewing, hand weaving, and surface design. Today we're going to talk about a Japanese mending called Boro. And Boro is a revitalization of worn textiles. You know, every country in the world has its own aesthetic and its own relationship with tattered textiles and extending the life of those textiles. In Japan, the term is Boro. In England, you know, during the war, they had the make, do, and mend. In the US, there was a stitch in time saves 9. So all of those countries have their own historic method of extending the life of their favorite textiles. In order to demonstrate the Boro, you can't just make Boro. Boro involves the worn textile that you are mending and patching and sewing. So we're going to do a Boro influenced textile. Most of the textiles that are from Japan have been stitched in some kind of Sashiko design. And Sashiko is a form of decorative stitching. It began during the Edo period, which was mid-1600s. It's a practical method of repairing worn fabrics. It makes them both warmer and thicker. Traditionally, they used white cotton thread on an indigo blue textile. It was said to resemble snow on the falling farmhouses. You know, mending has become very popular again. If you look at things like this, remember in the 70s when we were all patching and embroidering our jeans? It's popular again. All those things, you know, they said they were going out of style, they always come back. And even in Japan, the newer generation has taken up with the mending and patching, and so there are books available in Japanese. They have wonderful pictures, so it's easy to pick up how they're making those textiles. So you see where there are patches on top of the fabric and patches below the fabric that are then stitched in. To make a small Sashiko patch, you will need a piece of fabric. You could use this thin weight denim. I would not suggest that you start with the thicker stuff, but the thin stuff is nice. You could also use a medium weight cotton or any other natural fiber, you know, that has a similar weight. You also need a needle and the thread, a small pair of scissors, and a fabric marking pencil. You know, quilters have really nice tools, and so this is a quilter's marking pencil. It's filled with chalk, and it makes a really fine line. I like this because the line stays sharp. You could also use just a regular colored pencil in a light color, so white or tan or yellow will work. It's helpful to have a clear ruler that has small grid marks on it. So to begin with, I've decided I'm going to do my Sashiko patch in a leaf shape. So I've drawn a very simple leaf shape on my denim. And before I begin stitching anything, I'm actually going to move this mat away a little bit. And we're going to draw with our clear ruler and our white pencil vertical lines. Vertical lines along the shape of the leaf. And I think, you know, it's easiest if you do them no more than 1/4 inch. So I line up my little ruler, and I actually like my quilter's marker best. I line up my ruler, I draw my vertical line all along the shape of the leaf. So you have the whole shape covered in vertical lines. And then the next step is to turn it 90 degrees and draw lines perpendicular to the vertical line. So you both have, when you finish, you'll have horizontal and vertical lines. So you have a grid. You have a little grid on your leaf shape. And then to get started stitching, I'm going to outline my leaf shape. So it will contain all of my Sashiko stitches. So to get started stitching, cut yourself a length of whatever your chosen thread is. I recommend no longer than, say, 36 inches. Make a knot in one end and I'm going to start at the narrow point. So you come up through the cloth, and I'm just going to do a stem stitch around the whole shape. So a stem stitch is take a stitch back toward the knot through the cloth and pull it up, and then go half the length of the stitch, and again go back toward the knot. And you continue doing that all the way around the shape. Now, if you are used to using an embroidery hook, you could put your fabric in an embroidery hook. I generally don't use one, and I just use my fingers and my thumb to put tension on the cloth. If you're doing it like that, just be careful and don't rub off all the grid marks that you've already so carefully put on there. So stem stitch all the way around the shape of the leaf. And then, presto, when that is done, this is what it'll look like. So then the next step is, get longer thread here. To begin the Sashiko stitching, and we're just going to do a very simple pattern for our patch. You know, as you practice and you do more and more, you can get more and more elaborate. But for the beginning, we're just going to do a basic stitch. And it's really, you don't need to follow a written pattern. What we're going to do is we're going to use the intersections of those grid marks as our guidelines. So here's my grid. Make it a little darker so you can see the first one anyway. It's going to come up from one point and down the next point where the squares meet. Can you see that? If you have a long enough needle, you can do a running stitch all the way down. So now I end up with a running stitch all along that line, and the points enter and leave the fabric at the intersections of my grid marks. The next line is the same, except it's on the opposite side of the squares. So I'm coming up at one end, I'm going down right at the point where my squares intersect. do the whole leaf shape, all the points where the grid is on your fabric. So here's my third row. My third row and my first row are exactly the same. Okay, so there's half of it done. Well, maybe not quite half of it, but you're going to do the whole shape like that, alternating the repeat pattern. Then when you get all of that done, we're going to come back and do it the opposite way. This time, you're going to use your previous stitches as your guides, and we're going to make little crosses. So if I come up in the center of the square and I make a little cross across the first stitch and then across the second stitch, and I'm going down in the center of the adjacent square, coming up and down in the middle of those squares. You know, that makes a cross right there. And then do the same thing all the way through, and then you'll find out that they alternate also. And the other thing you may notice is that I'm only stitching with one strand of thread. And that's easy to do because I have a thread that's thick and stands out against my fabric pattern. So if your thread is too thick, then it's hard to pull through the fabric. And if it's too thin, then you don't see the design very well. And so as you go, your pattern develops. You keep crossing the first stitches. And it doesn't matter, you know, if they're perfectly in the center of your square. We're not really going for perfection at this point in time. We're just making a nice aesthetic pattern across the whole shape. And go all the way to the end, even if you can't make the whole stitch. Make as much of it as you can. Okay, one more. So see here, I only have half a stitch on the end, and I'm just going to pretend that the whole thing is there. Come down in the center. Okay, so when you get all of this way done, then we have a couple of options. You can set that one aside. Here is my leaf shape with my whole cross pattern on it. And if you want to just leave it like that, that's perfectly acceptable. But if you want to add a few more, this time, if you look at your pattern, you can see that there's a diagonal line that runs between the X's, between the crosses. And those are the lines that we're going to stitch next. So what you want to do is pick out one of the crosses and go between it and its neighbor. Again, in a running stitch, and no bigger than the actual cross itself. So here's the first row. Taking a stitch between those crosses, up that diagonal space. See how that works? And then we're going to go back the other direction, but we're going to skip a row. So skip this next row and do your diagonal stitches along the next row. And again, you don't have to be perfect. And make sure you don't pull your stitches too tight. And even though I don't have 2 stitches there, I'm going to pretend I do. Oops. I'm going to pretend I do. And make my last stitch there anyway. And then I'm going to skip a row. And skip this row and make stitches in this next row. So now I have 3 rows of diagonal stitches between the X's in alternating spaces. Now almost to the last stitch now. And so my last one is, come up here, between the groups. So starting on the same line, this is my first row of stitching. I'm going to start on that row. I'm going to stitch perpendicular to my first row, down the diagonals between the crosses, like that. And again, I'm going to skip the next row and pick up the row after that. So between those 2 X's, down the diagonal between the crosses, don't pull them too tight. Skip the next one. You see there's little ridges in here now, usually. So it becomes a little dimensional. The more stitches you add, the more dimensional it becomes. And so as you see, you end up with little groups of 4 crosses. And your straight lines they bisect those little X's. Now, down here in the bottom, it seems like there's stitches missing. So I probably would go back and add something right here on the end. And there's not enough room for an X here, but there is room for something back here. So I would add an X here, maybe. Just to fill in that space, mimicking this one. have a finished Sashiko stitched patch. And you can either, you know, if you wanted to add this to something, you could turn the ends under and stitch it down either by hand or machine, or if you had a hole in your jeans, this could go behind the hole and then you could stitch around and it would fill up that space. So I hope you have enjoyed learning something new today. I appreciate all your attention, and I look forward to seeing what you can do with this little Sashiko snow stitch. Thank you. Okay, so I have brought a few samples of Boro textiles. This happens to be a piece from a vintage kimono, and you can see that it was very well loved. And these pieces were on the inside of the folded fabric. So the patch is so nice, you would barely even know it was there. And then I have matched it with some of my hand-dyed organzas in colors that I think are nice, and I may end up doing some stitching on this piece later on. And this is a piece of cotton, indigo dyed, many times patched, very thin but very lovingly extended. And this is a sample of Sashiko stitching. This happens to be an under jacket for a martial arts program. And so you can see that there's different stitching on the bottom than the top. This top is thicker, so it would pad the shoulders more. And then here is a piece of Boro that I have stitched. It's on an old towel, and it will become a mat at some point. But there are old pieces of Japanese fabrics, some of my hand-dyed indigo fabrics, and then just very simple straight line stitching. And that adds integrity to the cloth, so it's thicker and sturdier and won't wear out as much. And then I'll show you my very first piece of Boro stitching. And it was a piece of Pendleton wool, I believe, that I left too long and the moths got to it. So along the folds, the moths had eaten away at the fabric. And my idea was to add fabric to the wrong side and then stitch through it. And this is my contemplative piece, you know, when I don't have anything else to do, when I'm just thinking about something or working on a project. This is the piece that I go back to continually and just add one more piece of fabric and some more stitching, and eventually it will become something else. But all of the holes have remained. They're just extended the life of the textile is all. I wanted to show you the garment, the jacket that I'm wearing. This is kind of typical to some of the things I make. I don't do production work, I do one-of-a-kind things. And this particular jacket started off with one piece of Judilee fabric that I loved. And I generally always have a little packet of something with me to stitch on. I'm not a very patient person. So when I have to wait, you know, if you're waiting at the dentist's office or someplace else, don't do it in traffic. People behind you get mad. But I always have something in my purse to stitch on. And so I started stitching on this one piece of Judilee fabric, not knowing what it would become. And then I decided, oh, I like that piece together with this other piece, and started making a bigger piece of fabric. And then I found this old cashmere sweater at a thrift store, and I thought, that gray is the same as this gray. And so I took the sweater apart, started matching up the fabrics, did some more stitching on it, and made myself a jacket. I like remaking things. I make things out of old linens and old tablecloths and old blankets. And I find that mixing textiles is easy to do. All of my textiles go in the washing machine first, so I can mix silks and cottons and wools and linens. I generally only use natural fibers. If they've been well worn, then they have already shrunk as much as they're going to. And you can just piecemeal things together to make a new garment or a new placemat or anything for your house.